let's go straight to Land Use 101. I give this talk, 3 or 4 times a year, mainly to realtor groups, and I'm always surprised how little folks know about land use in Oregon. Oregon's a unique land use system, and we'll get to that. But it shocks me that people really don't understand much about land use. And so, I get asked on occasion, well, why should I really care about land use in Oregon? And the answer to that is because every single acre of land that you either sell for a client or help a client buy if you're representing the buyer, or buy yourself or own yourself, is subject to state and local land use regulations. And those regulations dictate what you can do with the property. And I'm sure a lot of you looking around the room have had a fair amount of experience with buying and selling properties or representing folks that are doing that. You all know that the zoning on the property and the overriding state statutes and administrative rules in many cases will dictate down to the square foot what you can and can't do with that property. And unless you know as a realtor what you can and can't do with the property, it's kind of tough to advise a client, well, yeah, you can go ahead and build a house out there on that 40 acres in rural Clackamas County. Well, maybe you can and maybe you can't, but unless you have some familiarity and understanding of how the land use system works, it's really going to be hard for you to answer that question. And the same if you're if you're buying on your own, if you're the buyer yourself, you have an idea of what you'd like to do with the property. And I can't tell you how many times I get calls from people who say, look, there's this property for sale. It's been my dream to do whatever, and I'm looking at this land out here in Harney County or Malheur County or Columbia County or Multnomah County or whatever. Oh, and here's my first caveat of the day, and I've said this for over 20 years: never buy property in Multnomah County or the city of Portland. Okay. It's just not worth it, okay? Just don't do it. You can go to Washington County, you can go to Clackamas County, or if you really want a friendly county, you go to Yamhill County. Buy your property there, save yourself the years of stress and time and energy that you'd otherwise spend dealing with Multnomah County or the city of Portland. But in any event, if the use that you want to make on your property is not allowed by the zoning ordinance and by LCDC goals and rules and state statute, then you can't do it. And so as a profession, you, of all the professions besides us land use lawyers, really ought to know all about the land use system. It's vitally important for your particular profession, and Oregon is very unique in that regard. So you need to know the nuances of what we do here in Oregon, which isn't the same as Idaho or Massachusetts or Hawaii or any of the other states where we have mainly local control. We have a statewide planning system here that's different. So here's the basics. We'll start with, and these are sort of the things that all of you should know, okay? We start with Senate Bill 100. Senate Bill 100 was passed by the Oregon legislature in 1973. It created our statewide centralized land use planning system, the one that we have in place right now. It is considered either the father or the mother of Oregon's, I don't want to be a misogynist, so the father or the mother of Oregon's, of our land use system. It started it all. We've spent the better part of 45 years now tinkering with Senate Bill 100, and I know a lot of people in the legislature who were there and voted for Senate Bill 100. There are folks that will tell you that what we have today is nothing like what was intended with Senate Bill 100. In fact, we had an article in our Looking Forward newsletter a few years ago from a legislator who voted for Senate Bill 100, and the title of the article was, "My Vote for Senate Bill 100, the Worst Vote I Ever Took in the Legislature," because what we have now has morphed and really doesn't look like what Senate Bill 100 was intended to do. But nevertheless, whenever you start talking about land use, you will hear people talk about Senate Bill 100. Then we have the Oregon Revised Statutes. Those are known as ORS. The Oregon Revised Statutes are the laws that are passed by our legislature. They are binding on everyone in the state unless they specifically provide otherwise. Those basically are the state laws. We have LCDC. And I ask, do you know who this is? Because it surprises me that people don't know who LCDC is, especially realtors. I was at UGB, I gave UGB 101 talk. UGB is the Urban Growth Boundary. UGB 101 talk in Bend earlier this fall. And then I did a presentation on barriers to housing to a realtor group down in Albany in October, I believe. At the Bend conference, there were about 40 people, 40 realtors there. And I asked, okay, how many of you know who LCDC is? And out of those 40 people, I got about 4 hands. I didn't ask at the Albany conference, and I'm not going to ask today. But if you don't know who LCDC is, you really need to know. And I'll tell you right now. LCDC stands for the Land Conservation and Development Commission. They are a 7-member commission appointed by the governor. You don't know who they are, probably. You don't know what they do, probably. They're not elected. You can't vote for them. But they essentially have the power to dictate and through the passage of goals and administrative rules, all of the land use criteria for every city and county on privately owned land, for every city and county in the state of Oregon. So they were created by Senate Bill 100 in 1973, and they adopted their first set of goals in 1975. And they really, essentially, they are the land use body for the state of Oregon. And amazingly, I found over the years, until people get caught up with a land use problem, they don't know what LCDC is. So now we move on to the statewide planning goals. If you understand what LCDC is, you'll also understand that their primary charge, the mission of that commission, is to enact statewide planning goals. There are 19 statewide planning goals in Oregon. They're supposed to all hold equal weight. They don't all hold equal weight. Some of them, LCDC has spent a lot of time on some of them and not much time on the others. But LCDC adopts statewide planning goals. The first 14 goals, goals 1 through 14, were enacted in 1975. The last 5 goals have been enacted subsequent to that. We'll go in as we split this lecture into urban versus rural land uses. We'll talk about the particular goals that are really important for either an urban use or a rural use. But just understand that LCDC has 19 statewide planning goals, and they also have Oregon administrative rules. Those are known as OARs, and not the realtors. They're Oregon administrative rules for us land use lawyers. Those administrative rules are enacted by LCDC, and they have, once they're enacted, they have the same force and effect as a law passed by our legislature. So 7 people who you don't know, who were not elected, were appointed by the governor to essentially oversee the entire land use system that affects every square foot of privately owned property in this state, have the ability through administrative rule adoption to adopt rules that have the same force and effect as the 90 people that we elect to serve in the legislature and the one person that we elect as the governor. That's important and not very well understood. Now we move down to the Metro Functional Plan. I am happy to tell you that if you're not in Metro's jurisdiction, you don't have to worry about this at all. But if you are in Metro's jurisdiction, you have to worry about the Metro Functional Plan. The Metro Functional Plan, Metro is our regional government for the Portland Metropolitan Region, Washington County, Clackamas County, and Multnomah County. Metro has jurisdiction over parts of all of those three counties, but there are parts of those counties that are outside of Metro's jurisdiction as well. Metro, their functional plan has land use components in it. It's divided into titles. They typically don't deal directly with an individual land use application, but you should know what they are if you're trying to develop land inside Metro's jurisdiction. Then we have the local comprehensive plan and the local zoning ordinance. Now, one of the things that Senate Bill 100 created was a requirement that cities and counties enact comprehensive plans and zoning ordinances. Prior to that time, a number of cities had local zoning ordinances, but a number of cities and counties did not. One of the main things of Senate Bill 100 was to create the requirement that every city and county have a comp plan and a zoning ordinance. And when you look at the comp plan is more like the constitution for the city. It's usually amorphous. It doesn't have specifics. It says this is kind of what we want, and then the zoning ordinance goes in and fills in the blanks of the comprehensive plan. So all of those are basics that we need to understand in order to get how our land use system functions. Now we'll move on to the hierarchy. This starts at the top and ends at the bottom. So if you're down at the bottom, if you're CC&Rs, those are subservient to every single thing above them in this list. So we'll start at the very top. We have the U.S. Constitution, and for land use and development, when we're talking about the U.S. Constitution, we're really talking about the Takings Clause, the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that says private property shall not be taken without just compensation. Well, we understand what that means for the most part. Essentially, if a school district wants to come in and buy 10 acres of your property to put a new school in, the Constitution says that they can do that provided that they demonstrate that it's a public use and they pay you just compensation. That's the Takings Clause in a nutshell. Now there are variations of that. We have the Kelo case. I don't know if you remember the Kelo case. That was the case out of Connecticut where the city of New London decided that they were going to take some homes along the waterfront so that the Pfizer company could build a drug manufacturing plant to employ people in the city of New London. So they were essentially taking property from one private citizen and turning around and handing it to another. The city, the U.S. Supreme Court said that was okay, and of course set off a firestorm. We, Oregonians in Action, addressed that in 2006 with the passage of Ballot Measure 39. So we made sure that even though the Supreme Court said that was okay under the Takings Clause, it wasn't going to happen here. And then we have the other variation is the exaction issue, the Dolan case that we handled in the mid-90s at OIA out of Tigard, where John Dolan went to apply to expand his plumbing store in Old Town Tigard, and the city of Tigard said, okay, we'll let you expand your plumbing store, but you're going to give us a 10-foot strip of your property for a bike path. And John said, I'll sell you a 10-foot strip of my property for a bike path. And the city said, if you want your land use permit, you're going to give us a 10-foot strip of property for your bike path. And of course, John, being an old, he was elderly at the time, he's dead now. John, being an elderly guy that strongly believed that he didn't have to do that, challenged that case from the Tigard Planning Commission to the Tigard City Council to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals to the Oregon Court of Appeals to the United States Supreme Court, and we lost every step of the way until we got to the U.S. Supreme Court, where we won, and then back down from the U.S. Supreme Court to the Oregon Court of Appeals, to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals, and finally to Washington County Circuit Court, where 10 years after we started this fight, the Washington County Circuit Court, right at the end of the first week of trial, the city of Tigard realized that things weren't going well for them, and they ended up buying that 10-foot strip of land from John Dolan for $1.5 million. But that took 10 years and a trip to the U.S. Supreme Court for that to happen. My point is, the Takings Clause is really the part of the U.S. Constitution that applies here. But it's not, you won't deal with the Takings Clause much in the land use process. We then have federal law. We've got RLUIPA, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Federal law there's not much, the feds stay out of zoning and planning for the most part. RLUIPA is one of the few federal laws that we actually use as part of a land use application, especially one if we're dealing with, as the acronym states, with a religious use. We have used that law in the past to cite churches in rural parts of the state, and even though our land use system would prohibit the church from being cited there, we were able to use federal law and say, look, federal law overrides your state and local land use requirements, and so that's going there. But again, the main point there is that you don't have to deal much with federal law in the land use, in Oregon land use. Then we have the Oregon Constitution. The Oregon Constitution has a Takings Clause, much like the federal Constitution does. It's Article 1, Section 18 of the Oregon Constitution, but not surprisingly, our Supreme Court and Court of Appeals do not take such an expansive view of our Takings Clause as the U.S. Supreme Court does of the federal Takings Clause. So if you're going to bring a Takings Clause claim, you might throw in an Article 1, Section 18 argument, but for the most part, you're going to stick with the Fifth Amendment. Now we get down to where we really start to have laws that affect land use planning in Oregon, and that's number 4, the Oregon Revised Statutes. Most of the land use stuff you'll see in Oregon, you'll find in chapters 195, 197, 215, and 227. 195 has Measure 49 language. It has some wetlands language. 197 is the main land use planning chapter in the statutes. It's where LCDC is described, their powers are described, etc. 215 applies to counties, and 227 applies to cities. From there, we get the LCDC goals and the Oregon administrative rules. Because they're lower than the statutes, we know that if you have a conflict between an LCDC administrative rule and the statute wins, okay? Most of the nitty-gritty details of any particular land use application, particularly if it's a rural application, you'll find in the LCDC goals. Then we've got the functional plan. We talked about that a minute ago. Then we have the comp plan and the local zoning ordinance. We talked about that a minute ago. And then finally we have private zoning, CC&Rs. So if you want to live in a neighborhood with CC&Rs, more power to you. I would not. It seems like there's always one person in the neighborhood who becomes the neighborhood Nazi and goes around and tells everybody else that their grass is a 1/4 inch too high and they need to mow it, or an 1/8 of an inch or whatever, or they can't have their truck out in their pickup truck out in their parking lot or whatever. Having said that, almost all new development, as you folks will know, is subject to CC&Rs, and so it's becoming harder and harder, unless you're like me and live out in the country, to find a place that's not subject to CC&Rs. So we move on. Let's get into urban land use, and then we'll talk about rural. On urban, there's really three kinds of urban zones in cities, and now we're talking about cities and unincorporated. You know, there are large parts of the Portland, of Metro's urban growth boundary that are unincorporated. Aloha, for example, that whole area, Aloha is not a city, it's an unincorporated urban area. Washington County plans and has jurisdiction over that. But for the most part, we're talking about cities, and the zoning breaks down pretty simply. It's the old Euclidean zoning model: residential, commercial, industrial. We've had for about the last 15 years or so a move into mixed use zoning, where we have condos with commercial, ground floor commercial, and then residential over the top of that. So we're moving away from that old traditional model where we put the houses in one part of town. We put the commercial properties typically in the center part of town, and then wherever we had space left, usually the wetlands, we zone that industrial. Okay, we're moving away from that, and as we start to enact smart growth policies. But that's typically what you're going to find in town. So when we're, yeah.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
You said earlier that all communities in Oregon are required to have their comp plan and their zoning and everything else. Isn't there a size component on that? Aren't there some small communities that do not go through that, but leave it to the county?
No, if you didn't hear in the back, the question was, is there a size component to the requirement that all cities and counties have comp plans and zoning ordinances? And the answer to that is no. The legislature a few years ago enacted a law that said that the smaller cities no longer have to go through periodic review where they update their zoning ordinance and comp plan. So a lot of the cities, especially when you get over into Eastern Oregon, a lot of the cities, their zoning ordinances were enacted in 1979 or 80 or whenever it was, right after LCDC finally told them you have to do something, and those haven't been changed. I think about Merrill. Anybody here know where Merrill, Oregon is? Yeah, that's right. My dad was born and raised in Merrill. It's about 20 miles south of Klamath Falls, right on the border next to Tule Lake. Merrill had a population in 1945 of 800 people. Merrill has a population in 2018 of 800 people. And so they don't have a whole lot of planning and zoning issues in Merrill because nothing ever changes. So we get to LCDC's, now these are the goals that are going to apply if you're talking about urban uses, okay? We've got goal 1, which is the citizen participation goal, goal 3, which is ag lands, goal 4, which is forest lands, goal 5, which is the natural resources goal. We'll talk a little bit about that. Goal 11, which is urban services, designed to make sure that if you have development, there are adequate urban services to serve that development that you're proposing. And goal 14, which is the urban growth boundary, and which is really where we're going to start. Goal 14 created urban growth boundaries. It was one of the first 14 goals enacted in 1975. Oregon is unique with an urban growth boundary system. There are some other states and regions within states that have enacted similar principles, but Oregon is really still 45 years later sort of one of a kind in urban growth boundaries. And I've copied the goal language there for you. But the idea behind goal 14 is that we're going to establish UGBs, urban growth boundaries, and the last part, it really tells you what it's going to do, what the main purpose of the goal is. It's to identify and separate urban uses from rural uses, okay? So if you're inside the urban growth boundary under our land use planning system, you're supposed to be making urban uses. The cities and counties are supposed to be making urban uses of their land inside the boundary. If you're outside the UGB, those areas are supposed to be preserved for rural land uses. That's basically, in a nutshell, what Goal 14 provides. So you say, okay, well, what's an urban growth boundary? Well, an urban growth boundary really isn't anything other than, I don't know why I wrote it this way, an invisible line. Well, there's no such thing as an invisible line. It is a line drawn on the city's comprehensive plan map that you can go and look. If you're going to Salem, you can go to the city of Salem and say, do you have a map of your urban growth boundary? And they'll print you out a nice shiny color map that shows you where their urban growth boundary is. If you actually went out to those properties and looked and said, okay, where's the urban growth boundary? You won't find a wall or stakes or anything like that. You won't be able to see it, but you have to go to the county and you'll find out where the urban growth boundary is, because it's a line drawn on their map, on their comp plan map. And the idea behind it, as I said earlier, is it's going to separate the urban uses from the rural uses. That's why land inside the urban growth boundary typically sells for a lot more than land outside the urban growth boundary, because you could do a lot more with the land inside the urban growth boundary. It usually, but not always, also marks the boundary between where the city has planning jurisdiction and the county has planning jurisdiction. As I said earlier, in the metro area, the cities within Metro's jurisdiction do not have their own urban growth boundaries. Metro has an urban growth boundary for all the cities within the region, and there's a lot of land in the Metro urban growth boundary that is outside of cities. It's unincorporated, and in those areas, the county typically retains planning jurisdiction, even though it's inside the urban growth boundary. But for the most part, for most Oregon cities, they have an urban growth boundary. They exercise planning jurisdiction inside the boundary. Once you get outside the boundary, it's the county. So if I have a 10-lot subdivision in the city of Beaverton, I'm going to be dealing with Beaverton. If I have a dog kennel on EFU land in Washington County, outside of the Metro's urban growth boundary, I'll deal with Washington County. So how do we ensure that we have adequate land for development of all kinds, housing and the other kinds of development inside the urban growth boundaries? Well, that now is where we turn to ORS 197-296. And remember, in our hierarchy, the statutes were above the local regs and Metro's regs and LCDC's rules. So this statute takes precedent over everything below that. It really is, for land use purposes, the statutes are really at the top. And ORS 197-296, which was passed by John Chandler, one of my buddies for the home builders, in 1995, it really is the holy grail of planning for the development community inside urban growth boundaries, because it requires all of the larger Oregon cities with at least 25,000 people, to have sufficient land inside their UGBs to accommodate estimated housing needs for 20 years. And the way that the cities demonstrate that, the LCDC keeps an eye on the cities and requires them to do what's known as buildable lands inventories. So they have to do a buildable lands inventory to demonstrate that they've got enough land, available land, inside their urban growth boundary. Metro does this for the metro region, to handle all of the residential development that's going to occur over the next 20 years. Now you can argue, and I have at the Capitol, that Metro tends to, well, pardon my French, make shit up with their buildable land inventory, and counts a lot of land for redevelop as some developed land that can be developed more intensely and create a number of units, where we can all look at that land and say, okay, you could say that that land at some point is going to have 400 units of multifamily, and we all know it ain't never going to have 400 units of multifamily, but Metro counts it as 400 units of multifamily and thereby shorts the region however many units above what it'll actually ever develop at. And so we end up with a shortage of land inside the Metro UGB, which means the housing prices go up. As the housing prices go up, The people that should be buying houses, the younger people that should be buying houses, can no longer afford to buy houses, so they stay in the rentals longer. As they stay in the rentals longer, the vacancy rates in the rentals go down, the landlords raise the rent, and the people at the very bottom that could afford the rent but now can't because the rent gets raised become homeless, and then we have a whole bunch of new problems as a result of that, and then the legislature gets crazy and decides we're going to have rent control, which only exacerbates the problem. But now I'm into Jillian's talk, and so I'm not going to talk about that anymore. But the point is, the cities are supposed to, and Metro are supposed to maintain a 20-year buildable lands inventory, and it really is, for all of us that are trying to develop land in the boundary, it really is the most important statute that we have. LCDC also has a rule that says that the cities have to have buildable land supply for employment uses. The 20-year buildable land supply requirement in the statute applies to residential, not industrial or commercial. But that's an important statute. So what do we do? You know, what if a city does its buildable land inventory and they say, oh my God, we've got so much growth into the Portland or into the region or into our city or whatever, and we've discovered through our buildable lands inventory that we need a bit more land for housing. They do one of three things. They expand the boundary, expand the UGB, they increase density, or typically what they do is number three, they do a little bit of both. They do a they try and get a boundary expansion, and they try and change the density in some of their residential neighborhoods to accommodate the next 20 years worth of people that want to move there. Metro is in the process of doing this right now. They're meeting next week, or they're meeting actually Thursday, and then the following Thursday on a proposal by 4 cities, Sherwood, King City, Beaverton, Hillsborough, and Wilsonville to expand the boundary. I think they're expanding by 2,000 acres, I think is the total of the expansion, which will create 9,000 units. You'd think, well, gee, 9,000 units, that's a lot, except Metro, by their own estimate, has determined that we need 300,000 units in the Portland metropolitan region to have 20 years worth of buildable land supply. Their urban growth boundary expansion will only accommodate 9,000 units, meaning they've got 291,000 units to try and shoehorn into the existing urban growth boundary, which means the people in the city of Portland who bought homes on 5,000 square foot lots and thought they were in heaven are all of a sudden going to find themselves with having 4 1,000 square foot tiny homes, or 4 tiny homes on 1,000 square foot lots, with all those people driving their cars and trying to park on the streets. And all of a sudden, the whole idea of, well, gee, you know, we like a tight urban growth boundary may not be so popular anymore. But we'll see. So, we talked about goal 3 and 4 at the start of this urban use, and you say, well, why do we care about goal 3 and 4? That's the farm and the forest land goals. And goal 3 says that ag lands shall be preserved and maintained for farm use. The whole idea of goal 3 is that we're going to maintain an ag base. Now remember, Senate Bill 100 and these goals were enacted in the mid-70s when the 2 primary industries in Oregon were ag and forest. So these 2 goals were really at the heart of Oregon's land use planning system. Goal 3 is the ag land goals, basically says farmland, we're going to use farmland for farming. Goal 4 is the forest land goal, to conserve forest lands by maintaining the forest land base. And at that time, the timber industry was by far the leading industry in Oregon. It's not that way anymore. The spotted owl took care of that. But you know, at that time, that was the industry, and we haven't changed the language of goal 3 and 4 since they were first enacted in 1975. So, how much land in Oregon is farm and forest land? And we'll tell you what this will get to why this is important in terms of urban development. All of it is the answer, and we've talked about this for years. These are LCDC's numbers. These aren't numbers that Jillian's and Chandler and I made up on the back of a napkin. These are real, honest-to-goodness LCDC numbers. According to LCDC, 97% of all the privately owned land outside of urban growth boundaries in Oregon is zoned for farm and forest use. So if you get outside of an urban growth boundary in Oregon and you find private land out there, 97% of that private land will be zoned as either farm or forest, or maybe mixed farm forest. There's some of that too. And in the Willamette Valley, I think those numbers are even higher than 97%. Basically, everything outside of urban growth boundaries in the Willamette Valley will be zoned for farm or forest use. And this last point is the key. Urban development is inconsistent with farm and forest use. And so LCDC takes a very dim view. If you want to go out and do a 240 lot subdivision on 40 acres of EFU land in, between Salem and Portland, okay? They don't like that. So understand that when you go to when a city decides to expand its boundary, chances are almost certain, 100% certain, that they're going to expand onto what's zoned for either farm or forest use. And when they try and do that, LCDC doesn't take they don't like that very much. So the point is, it's tough for a city to expand its urban growth boundary in Oregon, and we've seen that play out, especially in the Willamette Valley, as city after city has struggled to expand its urban growth boundary. Metro has expanded its urban growth boundary a few times since they got land use planning authority in the 80s. Every time they've expanded their urban growth boundary, they've been sued, and every time they've been sued, they've lost, and every time it's come back to them and they've had to fix it, or as was the case in 2014, the legislature finally got tired of them screwing around, and we had so many people coming here and moving here so fast that we needed the land now, and the legislature stepped in and said, okay, Metro, we're tired of waiting for you to get this done right, and the legislature did it for them, at least for Washington County. Now, we'll move on from goals 3 and 4 and 14 to LCDC's goal 1. If I hear anything at the Capitol from the lay people that come down and testify on land use, I hear more about goal 1 than anything else. Goal 1 is the state citizen involvement goal. I've laid out on the first bullet point what it's designed to do. It's essentially designed to give people the right to participate in land use planning in Oregon. And we, both in the statutes and in the administrative rules, have taken that to the extreme. Okay? It's not a popular position to go down to the Capitol and say the public shouldn't be involved in every single land use planning decision that there is, but that's the position I take all the time, because we have overkilled citizen participation in this state. And we've done that by making nearly all land use applications, whether these be urban applications or rural, subject to a multi-level review, okay? We have typically an application is filed, that application goes to a planning commission or a hearings officer. From there, it can be appealed by anyone who shows up. It can be appealed to the city council, the board of county commissioners, whatever it is, the final decision maker for the county or the city. From there, it can be appealed to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals. From there, it can be appealed to the Oregon Court of Appeals. And from there, it can be appealed to the Oregon Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court doesn't have to take it, and they typically don't take many land use cases. But the point is, it takes a long time to get through that process. And not only does it take a long time to get through that process, where your time is money in the development community. So not only does it take a long time to get there, but if there are 78 approval criteria in for your whatever it is you're trying to do, and the city in their final order says, okay, here's how we've met all 78 of these criteria, how the applicant has met all 78 of these criteria, And it turns out that LUBA says, well, gee, you know, you did a really good job. You met 77 out of the 78, but you didn't meet the 78th. Then guess what happens? The whole thing goes back and you start over. And so the point is, we have overkilled citizen participation. Should the citizens get to be involved in land use planning decisions? Yes, but they ought to be involved at the front end of the process when the cities are doing their comp plans and zoning ordinances, rather than at the back end when we have individual applications that get yo-yoed back and forth up and down the legal ladder and, you know, make it more difficult to actually get anything done. So there's my tirade on goal 1, but again, I tell the legislature that all the time, and believe me, it's hard to get elected officials to take the position that the citizens shouldn't be entitled to vote on every single thing that that they think they ought to. So who takes advantage of goal 1? Well, those people are NIMBYs mainly. They're also known as the friends of something. I can tell you right now, with 100% certainty, if you are representing an applicant in a local hearing and someone gets up during the, because remember, anybody who shows up can testify and they can say whatever they want. If someone shows up and says they are from the friends of something, they are not your friend, okay? They are probably a NIMBY. NIMBY is the acronym, you've probably all heard it. It stands for Not in My Backyard. Oh, I'm a big supporter of the land use system. Yes, I believe we need development. I understand that people are moving to the area, and I totally support that 240-unit apartment complex as long as it's over on the other side of town. Okay? Those are the main people that I hear talking about goal 1. Now, I won't waste a whole lot of time on that. You know what that is, right? Well, that's a banana. So what are bananas? I refer to bananas as the Hezbollah splinter faction of the NIMBYs. They are also known as Land Watch. Okay, isn't that sort of an ominous term, you know, Land Watch? We're keeping our eye on you. What a banana stands for is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything, okay? These folks think that the last subdivision that should be built is the subdivision where they just bought a house. And nobody else should come after them. They like it just the way it is, and so we're going to make sure that we don't have any more development. Well, that's fine if Oregon wasn't growing, but the Portland metropolitan region is growing at about 300,000 people every 10 years, and it's been steady doing that for the last 30 years. And so we got to find a place for all those people to live. So as long as people keep having kids and Californians keep moving up here because they can't find an affordable house in their state, we are going to have to find places for them to live, and the whole banana thing doesn't work very well. I have a credo that I live by, and if you were ever my realtor and I was looking to buy a house to live in, this would be my charge to you. I will never buy property next to a NIMBY or a banana, ever. Life's too short, and the majority of calls that I get from property owners who are having some kind of land use problems are typically generated because of a neighbor, okay? Life's not worth it living next to a neighbor that's going to call the county or the city every time you do something that they don't like very well. I'll give you the opposite to that. I bought my house, I live on 3 acres in rural Washington County. I bought my house in 2002 and I moved in on Labor Day. My house was built in 1969. I spent Saturday of Labor Day weekend of 2002 tearing out green shag carpet from 1969. Shag carpet's gross. I don't know why people ever decided that it was a good idea, but somebody did, and they certainly did, and the people that built my house And so I tore out green shag carpet, and they had raised 9 kids in this house. And believe me, it was nasty. But I was tearing out green shag carpet on Saturday of Labor Day weekend in 2002. I had met my neighbor the night before. It was about 95 degrees that day at Labor Day, so it hadn't rained for 2 months. I go out there on Saturday morning covered with dirt and skin and whatever else came billowing out of that 1969 green shag carpet. And I look over at my neighbor, and he's got a burning barrel, and he's got flames coming out of that burning barrel like 6 feet high. And it hadn't rained for months. And we live out in the country. We don't live in, there ain't no fire hydrant anywhere nearby. And so I look at him, I said, must be a burn day. And he said, every day's a burn day here. And so I thought at that time, you and I are going to get along just fine. He does his thing, I do mine. But the point is, for me anyway, I would never buy, you need to know who your neighbors are before you buy something, because if you got a bad neighbor, if they're a friend of something, you don't want to live next to them. Okay, so now we'll move on to Goal 5. Goal 5 is the state's natural resource goal: scenic views, open spaces, historic areas, wildlife habitat, riparian areas, wetlands, the like. That goal applies a lot inside the urban growth boundaries, and the way that happens is cities will create Goal 5 overlay zones that sit on top of the underlying zoning of the property. So you may have R5, property zoned R5, residential 5 units an acre, and it may have a Goal 5 overlay on top of that, that even though it's under the R5 zoning, you could develop it at 5 units an acre. Because of the overlay, you may not be able to develop at 5 units an acre. You may not be able to develop that property at all. So you need to understand not just the underlying zoning, but if there are any Goal 5 overlays on that property. City of Portland has the environmental protection, the EP and the EC zones, the environmental protection and the environmental conservation zones. Those are their Goal 5 zones, and they are pervasive in parts of the City of Portland. So even though the zoning might be correct for the use that you want to do, if it has a Goal 5 overlay, you may not be able to do that. So you need to understand that as well. And then, so we get back to our question that we posited a little while ago. So the city needs to grow, so what's it going to do? Well, again, you can increase density, you can expand the boundary, you can do both, but the problem is, as you probably all are aware, if we try and increase density, you make the people in town that are already in town mad, so that's not very popular. If we try and expand the boundary, then we hear sprawl, you're sprawling out, urban sprawl, you're destroying all the sacred farmland that we have in the state. So that's not very popular. And then we add on all of the goals that we just talked about, the citizen participation goal, which gets the NIMBYs and the bananas in the door. And we've got the farm and forest land goals, and we got the natural resource goal, and we've got the Goal 11, which deals with urban services, and we got Goal 14, which deals with the urban growth boundary. We deal with all of those, and essentially you end up with difficulty. You guys know who that is, right? That's former Governor Kitzhaber. Needless to say, a lot of times Governor Kitzhaber and I didn't necessarily agree on policy, but he said this, and I totally agree with this. There are two things Oregonians hate: density and sprawl, okay? Well, that's fine when the state's not growing like in the 1980s, but it doesn't work very well when the people are moving here and we're trying to figure out places to put them. Then we've got the other state agencies that are involved. We've got DSL with their wetlands work. There will be legislation this session on DSL and their wetlands and their mitigation stuff. I'm deeply involved in that. That will be, I think, a positive. I'm not sure we can get it passed, but but it's coming. And we got DEQ with stormwater permits. We have SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, with historic resources. You've seen in the last couple of years, people in the more well-to-do neighborhoods in Portland all of a sudden deciding to expand their historic resource district and essentially try and prohibit density from coming into their neighborhood. We don't want to sprawl out onto farmland, and so the City of Portland, we're glad that the City of Portland is taking all of these additional housing units as long as they go over to the poor folk in North Portland or out in Lents or wherever. Just keep them out of our fancy neighborhood. And the state also regulates that, SHPO does. And then we have the Columbia River Gorge Scenic Act, which those of you from Hood River County, the eastern part of Multnomah County, and Wasco County know all about. That's an actual and interstate compact, and the Gorge Commission has all kinds of strange and unique rules for development in the gorge. The Gorge Commission is a bi-state compact. It's an agency of both the states of Oregon and the states of Washington. If you got gorge development issues, call me. I've done a fair amount of work out there, but for the most part, people outside the gorge don't need to understand that one. And then we have local issues on top of our state issues and the state agencies. We've got SDCs, which stand for System Development Charges. Those are the extra charges that a city imposes, typically a city, in some cases a county, imposes on development to offset the cost, the impact and the cost of the development. So we have transportation SDCs, we've got parks SDCs, etc. Depending on your jurisdiction, and those are really driven jurisdiction by jurisdiction, depending on your jurisdictions, SDCs can add as much as $50,000 a unit to every single house that you build in the neighborhood. It's interesting when, you know, the legislature says you guys need to build affordable housing, and you say, well, because Metro won't expand the urban growth boundary, land within the boundary that's available for development is selling for between $600,000 to $800,000 an acre, and we've got $50,000 SDCs on every single house we want to build. And so how do you again expect us to build affordable housing? And they look at you like you're from Mars, but it's the truth. And then we have exactions, which we talked about. We also have the local zoning with the Goal 5 inventories. We've got tree ordinances. A number of cities want to be tree friendly, which is fine, but when they're claiming that a particular piece of property will be available to develop at, say, 20 units, and the tree ordinances on the property are such that the most you'll ever get is 5, then they're shorting the region 15 units. We've got site design, height restrictions, setbacks, etc. And then we have the fun of annexation. Remember a while back, a number of cities had requirements that before they could annex land into their city for development, the voters had to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down on that. So even if you met all the land use criteria and the city council approved you to come in and annex, you still had to go to the voters for a thumbs up or a thumbs down, where the NIMBYs and the bananas, who had lost at every step of the way in the land use process, went out with 8 by 11 glossy mailers into every neighborhood saying we can't have any more growth here. And we got rid of that, by the way, in 2016 or 2015 or 16, I guess it was, at the legislature. So we don't have that deal with that problem anymore. So how are we doing? Housing permits, we average about 19,000 a year in our housing permits, according to the state economist, who also says we need 25,000 a year to keep up with the growth in Oregon. So we're falling short 6,000 units a year. We're underbuilding by 6,000 units a year. We're at 100,000. Our current shortage is at 100,000, and it's growing every year because we're underbuilding. And so with that, you're going to have all the associated problems. You've got a big demand and a short supply, so the prices are going to go up, and we've seen that. The prices are going up. and you make it harder for young folks who used to buy a house to do that. So now we'll move on to rural land use, and I've got just a few slides left. On rural land use, we're really talking about ag and forest for the most part. As I said, 97% of the privately owned land is zoned for ag and forest. We have small bits, that 3% that's left is comprised of rural residential, rural industrial, and the rural industrial sites are typically old mill sites that have been put to industrial use for 80, 90, 100 years. And so when the county went to do its first comp plan map, they said, well, that's an old mill site, we'll call that industrial. It's a rural industrial. And then we've got rural commercial, and you'll see a few of those around. And then you've got unincorporated communities. Those are typically towns that were loosely developed into a sort of a town prior to 1973. They're not a town, they're not incorporated, they don't have a mayor, they don't have a council, but they're a kind of a town. Any of you been to Pleasant Hill in Lane County on out of Eugene on your way over to Oak Ridge? Pleasant Hill is an unincorporated community. There is no city of Pleasant Hill. And that's what we've got in the rural areas. The main goals for the rural areas, again, are Goal 1, Goal 3, Goal 4, and Goal 5. Ag land, forest land, natural resources, and the citizen participation goal. Under Goal 3, ag land, farm use is an outright permitted use in the farm, in both the Goal 3 and the Goal 4 zones. Your typical farm designation, your Goal 3 designation is exclusive farm use, EFU. So if you go to most counties, their farm zones are going to be labeled exclusive farm use. So when I get calls from somebody that wants to do something on their 40 acres and I ask them how it's zoned, almost invariably I get EFU. That stands for exclusive farm use. There are some counties that have some variations of that. Washington County has an AF20 zone, Ag Forest 20. It's also an exclusive farm use zone, and all the exclusive farm use Goal 3 laws apply to it, even though it's called AF20. That confuses people. When you get outside of farming and forestry in Goal 3, they also allow accessory uses to farming, but they're generally considered conditional uses, so you have to get a land use approval for them. Which means that you're inviting the NIMBYs and the bananas in to share your pain for the next however many months they decide to torture you before you can get the right to build a house on 40 acres out in the pucker brush in Grant County, where no one should give a damn that you're going out to build a house on 40. In fact, Grant County ought to hold a party for you because Grant County's population is declining, and here's somebody that actually wants to develop something here. But those are treated as conditional uses, as farm dwellings, farm stands, processing plants, the like. And non-farm uses are also allowed, but they're also conditional and they're highly regulated. If you're talking about rural use, unlike urban use, a lot of the urban use regulations are done at the local level, and LCDC doesn't have they play a role, but it's not as big a role for the urban uses. When you're talking about rural uses, the counties have their comp plans and their zoning ordinances, but they are heavily influenced by LCDC's rules. LCDC really sets the standards for rural uses. And so they allow some non-farm rural uses, churches, schools, dog kennels, parks, campgrounds, basically low intensity things that you would normally find in a rural area. The chances of you having a campground in downtown Portland aren't very high, except they kind of do have some campgrounds in downtown Portland right now. Okay, the forest land, that's Goal 4. It's a lot like farmland. Forest practices are an outright permitted use. Dwellings in forest zones are heavily restricted, even more restricted than they are in farm zones. And timber harvesting, of course, is one of the things that's allowed and expected in a forest zone. But when you deal with the timber harvest, you're not dealing with Oregon land use law. At that point, you're dealing with the Forest Practices Act. The timber industry was smart back in '73. One of the things that they provided for was that we're not going to have our timber practices governed, dictated by the local governments. We're going to have the Oregon Department of Forestry do that. So they stayed, for the most part, out of the land use system, and they're governed by the Oregon Forest Practices Act. Then we've got Goal 5. Goal 5 is applies mainly inside the urban growth boundary, but it also applies outside the urban growth boundary too. You'll see a lot of the most common Goal 5 regulation that you'll see outside of the urban growth boundary is a mule deer, some type of winter range regulation, especially in eastern Oregon. Deschutes County, for example, has a Goal 5 mule deer winter range overlay. They apply that over the top, just like they do in town. They apply that over the top of the underlying zoning. So your EFU, you have an EFU base zone, and on top of that, you have a Goal 5 sensitive mule deer winter range overlay. And even though you might be able to do something based on the Goal 3 administrative rules and the county code, there are extra limitations imposed on that as a result of the Goal 5 mule deer winter range overlay. Sage grouse habitat is another one over in eastern Oregon. Those poor folks over there, by the way, we are growing like a weed in the Willamette Valley. In eastern Oregon, they are doing everything they can to get someone to move out there. They are actually, almost every eastern Oregon county is smaller today than it was in population than it was in 1950. They are having a hard time keeping their schools open. They're having a hard time keeping their hospitals open. And their towns are dying. And yet, under our state system, we treat those people the same way that we treat the people in the valley, which seems sort of bass-ackwards to me. We ought to be doing everything we can to figure out how to get people to move into those eastern Oregon counties. But obviously the LCDC doesn't see things the same way. And then we have Goal 1, again, our citizen involvement goal. LCDC really, for the first 40 years of the program, has spent an inordinate amount of time focusing on Goal 3 and 4. Why they've done that, I don't know. But they've ignored, for the most part, Goal 9, the economic development goal, Goal 10, the housing goal. Instead of focusing on those, which affect almost all Oregonians, because almost all of us live in town, instead of doing that, they've spent all of their time on Goal 3 and 4, adopting regulation after regulation to make it hard for someone to do something on rural land. And I never have understood why they've done that, but nevertheless, that's what they've done. Now, they're finally turning the corner on that. I guess they figured they've tortured people enough out in the rural areas. And of course, we also have Measure 49, which prevents them from enacting new regulations, which would take away a use that's allowed in a rural zone, including farm and forest practices. And so maybe we've succeeded in making it harder for them to do that. But, you know, the number of people that have come into my office over the 20 plus years that I've been doing this with just absolutely gut-wrenching stories about how they want to do the most simplest thing, build a house for themselves to live on their land, but they can't because some pinhead at LCDC decided that building a house on 20 acres outside of town was a bad idea. It occupied the first 20 years of my time at OIA trying to help those people. And we finally did with 37 and 49. And we're finally getting the state to move into to areas and actually getting them to be positive on areas of trying to make sure that we have development for our folks in the urban areas where we need the help. So with that, that's it.